Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. We welcome you once again to another edition, Wednesday nights with myself, Inayat Wadi, where we look at issues right across the entire world, global issues, current affairs. And tonight, once again, we are going to be focusing on 9/11. Now, with 3 days to go, we know the entire world will once again be looking back at 9/11, what had taken place 20 years ago. But it is clear that 9/11 has had a major impact on the world at large, on the Muslim world, Afghanistan as well, which was one of the first countries that obviously suffered the impact of a 9/11. And tonight we're going to unpack what has taken place in the last 20 years. We're going to reflect on a 9/11. But since 9/11, so much has happened around the entire world where we've seen not only the occupation of Afghanistan for close to 20 years. We've seen the occupation of Iraq. We've seen what has happened with the Arab Spring. We see what is taking place in Yemen, Rohingya, you name it, Libya, Muammar Gaddafi is gone. We've seen Saddam Hussein go. So a lot has taken place in the last 20 years, and not only in the Muslim world, but the entire world has felt the impact of 9/11. And tonight we have assembled an international panel. In fact, joining us out of the UK, we've got Taji Mustafa, Hizbut Tahrir UK. We've got Sami Hamdi, who's joined us. We've got Andy Worthington, the author of the Guantanamo Files. And we also have got Ibrahim Mois, graduate in political science and history, who are part of the panel this evening. And just to remind our viewers and listeners that you can listen to us on the various platforms of Salam Media this evening, but also you can view us on the Facebook page and also on Salam Media's YouTube channel. And going across to the panelists this evening, Taji Mustafa, Sami Hamdi, Ibrahim Mois, Andy Worthington. Assalamu alaikum, good evening, and welcome to all of you.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
Yes, Sami, I know you've got limited time, so I'm going to start off with you. And obviously, we are reflecting on what had taken place at 9/11, but more importantly, the last 20 years. A lot has changed in the entire world, and not only looking at the Muslim world, but also looking at the West. We've seen homeland security, we've seen draconian measures, we've seen so much happen in the last 20 years that has basically changed. It's changed the lives of many people. And just your thoughts, your reflections on what has happened since 9/11 and how this has impacted on the world at large.
First of all, thank you for having me. Thank you for having me on this panel. I think talking about such a broad period of time is always very difficult to do in a short period of time. But I think one of the most important legacies that we have from what happened in 9/11 is a number of things. I think, first of all, Islamophobia was made into a legitimate political stance that was able to be professed on the international stage, and it continues to do so today. We saw Tony Blair talk about the threat of Islamism. We've seen this rhetoric be adopted even by Gulf states that are trying to pursue some sort of lobbying efforts in Washington. We see the UAE as one of the prime advocates for this argument that Islamism or the idea of political Islam remains a permanent threat. I also think, however, that there's also been a change in terms of some of the attitudes towards US foreign policy. And I think this is bigger perhaps than anything to do with global perspectives towards Islam. I think it's important to remember that when 9/11 took place, the shock that was done to the American psyche, this idea that Americans had seen wars on television, they had seen disasters happen on television, they had seen atrocities of war on their television screens in Vietnam, in other places, in Bosnia and in other places in the world, but they had never actually had a real attack on their own home territory. So there was the shock to the psyche that made it almost politically impossible for there to be any other action other than face aggression that eventually took place against Afghanistan and the like. But under the Biden administration, the attitudes are very different. Where in 2001, there was an American public desire for blood, the American public desire for somebody to be held accountable for what took place to 9/11, and then Bush and Rumsfeld channeled that popular desire into punishing the entire region as opposed to just the perpetrators that were condemned even by the Muslim world. Under Biden, we see that the American public no longer has that appetite. They no longer have this desire for blood. The bloodlust is gone. The perspective of the need for revenge is gone. And that's why Biden is able to withdraw from Afghanistan, a war in which many US generals themselves believed was a pointless war and a futile war in the first place. And without taking too long, the reason I mention this particular point is because it is reflective of how the world is changing. The US is no longer the guarantor of security in the region. Blinken and Lloyd Austin, Blinken the Secretary of State and Lloyd Austin Defense Minister, are on a tour to the Middle East, not to reassure their allies, but rather to impress upon them that the US is no longer the guarantor of security and that they should be taking more matters in their own hands. This is the biggest shift that we've seen in the past 20 years, the move from this American hegemony to a multipolar world that the US still has no answers for in terms of how it's going to adapt. And we see that, and I'll finish on this point, we see that in Afghanistan, whereby the Taliban, for all of their victory and for all of their capacity in taking Kabul and for all of their resistance, the reality remains that one, Biden can still sanction them, and two, they are still pursuing international recognition that only Biden can give them. But rather than seeing an opportunity to work with the Taliban to give them this international recognition, we see this confusion between the US and between the EU that allows China and Russia to sort of swoop in. So even when you see a golden opportunity for the US to perhaps reorient its foreign policy, it's unable to see this, one, because of the shock, two, because of the American appetite or the lack of American appetite for foreign intervention, but three, and most importantly, this idea in Washington that the role of America is changing. It has to change, and I think that's perhaps the biggest consequence that we're seeing on the political stage, at least with regards to the war on terror.
Yes, shukran for that, Sami. And I just want to bring Andy into the discussion. Now, obviously, Andy, you've followed developments for the last 20 years. You've written extensively, and particularly looking at some of the documentaries, looking at your book on Guantanamo Files. And Sami mentioned shock to the psyche. Now, obviously, this has impacted on people, on ordinary people, and we've seen what has happened with Guantanamo Bay. We've seen what has happened at the black hole sites. We've seen what has happened at Bagram as well. And just looking at how 9/11 and pursuing this war on terror has affected people, ordinary people, in their day-to-day lives.
Well, I mean, obviously, when we look at the impact on people of the war on terror that was declared by the United States, then, we have hundreds of thousands of civilian deaths in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and elsewhere. But then we also have this prison system that was established at Guantanamo that also had other prisons in other places run by the military. So I'm thinking of Bagram in Afghanistan, where the normal rules regarding the imprisonment of people in wartime were completely done away with. So there are only two ways to deprive someone of their liberty that existed before 9/11, unless you're going to behave like a dictatorship. And that is that you take someone off the battlefield and hold them until the end of hostilities, and they're protected by the Geneva Conventions. Or they're people who've committed a crime, in which case you prosecute them in the United States in a federal court as swiftly as possible. And what happened after 9/11 was that the US did away with this. So it claimed that it was holding people as unprivileged enemy combatants who had no rights whatsoever. It's very fundamental for people to understand that it really meant no rights whatsoever as human beings. There was at the beginning no outside body that could intervene with any kind of authority to do anything about the way the Americans were treating people. And they were treating people with horrendous brutality. In the prison at Bagram, we know that many prisoners died there. It was a processing place for Guantanamo. Most of the people who were there ended up over the next few years being sent to Guantanamo, but it lingered on in Afghanistan, still under American control, as a prison that held thousands of people over the years in ways that did not conform to the Geneva Conventions, all of which helped the United States to lose the hearts and minds that would have been so essential for them to have actually got anywhere positive in Afghanistan. They lost hearts and minds in Afghanistan from the very beginning, and they never regained them. And unfortunately now, we've also over these years seen the CIA black sites which were established, the extraordinary rendition program, which involved the United States sending some people to prisons that were run by notorious human rights abusing regimes in other countries, where they could be tortured by proxy, and also, you know, these dreadful black sites which the US bullied other countries into establishing on their soil. These are long gone, but the accountability for them has never happened. And I think 20 years on, what we're really looking at as the definitive symbol of the horrendous injustice of the war on terror is the continued existence of the prison at Guantanamo Bay. And at Guantanamo Bay, there are 39 men still held. That's only 5% of the total men who've been held throughout the prison's history. So most of those men have been released. Most of them were released for political reasons. Very few of them were released for anything that had to do with the law. But the men who are still held, there are 10 men facing trials, but they're facing trials in a broken trial system that doesn't work. They should be in federal court, but they were tortured. Torture is incompatible with justice. So 20 years after 9/11, the men allegedly responsible for those crimes seem to be in a position where they can never successfully be prosecuted because of what the United States did to them. And the rest of the men who are held at Guantanamo are, we have 10 men at Guantanamo who have been approved for release by high-level government review processes, but are still held. Now, some of those men were approved for release in just the last few months under President Biden. But I think with the US defeat in Afghanistan, we're going to see a pushback from Republicans about releasing prisoners from Guantanamo, even though the two things are absolutely unconnected. And then we have these 17 other men at Guantanamo who have been called by the mainstream media forever prisoners. And there's an accuracy to that, because these are men who are specifically held without charge or trial. They are subject to administrative review processes. But the United States, and it was Obama who set up this specifically for this category of prisoner, can continue to be held indefinitely without charge or trial, unless they can demonstrate through this review process, which is a kind of parole type process, that it would be safe to release them. Now, 20 years after 9/11, with the US having left Afghanistan, the notion that there is any justification for holding anyone at Guantanamo who hasn't been charged with the crime has totally evaporated. These men, all of these men who are still held there, should be released. But the US is clinging on to notions that the claims against these men that they were connected to Al-Qaeda, which they've come up with from the early days of holding them. Anything connected to the Al-Qaeda that existed in 2001, staying in an Al-Qaeda affiliated guest house, is somehow sufficient to hold these men, to deprive them of their liberty without charge or trial for the whole of their lives. Now, the vengeance that you were talking about 9/11 is still something that I believe exists in relation to these handful of men at Guantanamo, on whom the vengeance that parts of America felt after 9/11 is still visited, because the notion that President Obama can somehow close Guantanamo easily is going to be up against resistance from Republicans and from right-wingers, for the same reason that it's been for 20 years, that they like holding people that they call the worst of the worst in circumstances that are unacceptable in any country that claims to respect the rule of law.
Well, thank you for that, Andy. And to bring Taji into the discussion. Now, Taji, we've seen the global dynamics that have been playing out. We've seen geopolitics that have been featuring very, very prominently. And just in unpacking and looking at 9/11, reflecting and its impact on the world at large, and particularly on the Muslim world. And, we all recall the coalition of the willing at that point in time. And when one looks at how U.S. foreign policy objectives and how they have basically influenced the world, and particularly looking at the Muslim world. And we've seen the Muslim world suffer the most as a result of 9/11. We've seen the increase in refugees. We've seen increases in internally displaced people. We've seen the wars, and we've seen millions of people. We've seen what has happened in Iraq, weapons of mass destruction, and all of this based on many lies. Yet, when one looks at the Muslim world, the suffering in the Muslim world, and how the negative consequences this has had for Muslims in general.
I remember, Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam ala Rasulillah. I remember sitting in an office in London and us crowding round a PC of a colleague who had internet access. Nowadays we can see the internet on all our mobile phones, but in those days it wasn't the case. And we all crowded on the floor when we watched this event unfold. And straight away you're thinking, this is massive, this is monumental, this is historic, this will change the world. And as you said, specifically, you started to, from the very first few days after that, you started to get a sense that what was in the crosshairs of the United States and her willing partners, people like Blair and the United Kingdom government, was the Muslim world, the blame and the targeting. If we fast forward 20 years, what became very clear very quickly within days, weeks, months, was that what was declared as a war on terror was actually far, 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 far wider than the issue of apprehending a man in Afghanistan. That really anybody who thought that quickly came to realize this was naive, because the rhetoric, women are wearing burqas. I remember Laura Bush, the first lady in America, giving a speech just weeks after 9/11, giving a speech, the first time by a first lady instead of the president, and talking about Afghanistan and need to rescue Afghan women, something we've heard even in the last few days. So it quickly became the ideas of Islam and the practicing of Islam, the ideas of an ummah became under target, the ideas that Muslims anywhere in the world want something called Sharia, as people in the West would call it, the idea that Muslims want Muslim unity, that they believe in an ummah, they care for Palestine, they want something called the caliphate to be the political system that they inherit from the time of the Prophet ﷺ. These ideas became under attack. So I think the first point that really drums home to me in terms of the Muslim world was the Western powers, not the Western masses, the Western powers saying, this really is a war on Islam. They didn't use those words, but it became very clear to Muslims across the world that their practicing and desire for Islam as a comprehensive system and them caring for their ummah, their brothers and sisters abroad, this was now told to be beyond the pale. So it was okay to drone people in Yemen, okay to drone people in Somalia, okay to drone people in North Africa, wherever it was, under the banner of the war on terror. Other regimes in China and elsewhere said, well, America's fighting a war on terror, fighting Muslims. We also have a problem with Muslims. So Islam and Muslims became under the crosshairs, and this became a war on Islam. The second thing we've seen is who helped the US in the last 20 years in the Muslim world. America's reach is limited. America's reach into Afghanistan. America needed Pervez Musharraf of Pakistan to say to the Americans, we give you unstinted support. And so handed the keys so they could invade, bomb, kill, and maim. And Andy and others have documented, and I think it was an ex-CIA man who said that during the war on terror, if you wanted somebody to disappear, if you wanted somebody to talk, if you wanted somebody to be tortured, you sent him to Egypt, you sent him to Jordan, you sent him to Syria. So the relationship between the quote-unquote so-called Muslim regimes in the Muslim countries, let me correct myself, and the US and the UK government finding common cause in their struggle against Islam, the idea that Muslims could be independent, could unite, could want an independent Islamic future became very clear. The war on terror became the banner for that. That's how it's affected the Muslim world and the disaster and devastation we've seen. Secondly, but things did not go plain sailing. That day in that office, I was concerned, and many of us were concerned about what was to come. And we did have a lot of reason to be fearful, because we can see the brutality, the wars, the attacks, how many wedding parties have been killed, men, women, children in Iraq and Afghanistan. But there was a feeling that America was a superpower and could do what she wants, how she wants, where she wants. But in the last 20 years, the war on terror has exposed the true face of capitalism. A few companies, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, have benefited hugely, but America has lost treasure, her sons and daughters. America has lost money and American values, Western values, if I could call that. The ideology, democracy, looking after women, freedom of speech. Oh, we don't do torture. Dictatorial regimes, they do torture, but then they open Guantanamo. So this has actually undermined what the West claimed she was trying to do in Iraq and Afghanistan, which is to rebuild the nation. So the Muslim world has stood strong. The failure of the West in terms of its leadership, its foreign policy in Iraq and Afghanistan, its failure of a global leadership nowadays with the COVID pandemic, its failure of the financial system. And the third point, my final point, is the war on terror 20 years on alhamdulillah, has shown the strength of the Muslim Ummah, that people in Afghanistan, bolstered by the Islamic faith, have been able to stand up against the superpower, and in a war, the superpower has had to say, well, okay, it's costing too much, and they've had to turn back. And so this is where we are now, that the Ummah desires Islam, wants Islam, and if we stand united, we are able to challenge the superpower. There are challenges. There's a lot of collateral, a lot of damage in the Muslim world. People killed, dictatorial regimes supported, chaos in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in all over the world. There's a lot of things we're facing. But I would say this moment presents an opportunity, challenges and opportunities for the Muslim world to reshape its future. And my final point, the war on terror has not gone away. It's still here. America still reserves the right to kidnap people, to bomb, kill land under this thing called the war on terror. And it has helpers across the Muslim world, but it cannot do as it please uninhabited, because the world has changed. And this is something which we can discuss going forward. There still is a challenge, but there's an opportunity.
Yes, certainly, shukran for that, Taji. And Ibrahim Moise, now, you being a researcher, a writer on modern Muslim history at the University of Toronto, and just looking at modern Muslim history in terms of being rewritten as a result of 9/11.
So we have to remember the circumstances when, that when the war on terror started. Which was, after the Cold War, basically the United States and its allies basically had the rule of the roost internationally. And the irony is that whereas such events as the Afghanistan jihad of the 1980s against the Soviet Union, such events were very crucial in the outcome of the Cold War, and the rise of the sort of unipolar world led by the United States. But the irony is that fundamentalist Islam, which was a very vague and very inconstantly applied sort of term, that became the next convenient enemy. So what the war on terror basically did was, as some others have mentioned, it sort of universalized this idea of of any sort of Islam that is not strictly under the control of governments, and in the specific case of the United States, under the control of a non-Muslim government that is not knowledgeable about, or it doesn't, obviously the United States is not a Muslim country, but they somehow overnight they became sort of the determinants of who is a moderate Muslim or who is an acceptable Muslim and who is a radical. And it was very inconsistent. It was based off, sometimes they would cite human rights. Sometimes they would cite, sort of geopolitital interests. It was a very inconsistent thing. And the tragedy, like Brother Taji mentioned, is that a lot of Muslim governments also sort of capitalized on this. It was somewhat under pressure, but they very quickly exploited it for their own means. So governments in Saudi Arabia, in Pakistan, in Iran, in Syria, we've seen all over the world, regardless of geopolitical camp, we've seen a lot of Muslim governments as well as non-Muslim governments, like China, for example, sort of weaponizing this war on terrorism against dissident Muslims, or against just independent Muslims in their own countries. So there's countless examples. So the war in Afghanistan very obviously did not have to be. Afghanistan did not have to be invaded after 9/11. There was plenty of opportunity to negotiate or to try to extradite Al-Qaeda or the perpetrators of the crime. But instead, they sort of took it as an opportunity to go and try to remake Afghanistan in their own image. They entered what was basically a civil war in Afghanistan between the Taliban and between their opponents, and they took one side, painted the other as irredeemably evil, completely ignored the history sort of the Afghanistan war, and made it into sort of a trying to rebuild Afghanistan in the image of the United States, which was never going to happen, and it very predictably it failed, and unfortunately at a great cost. And we saw in Iraq, obviously, the issue of weapons of mass destructions and the very very obviously false links that they invented, between Saddam Hussein and Al Qaeda. So these were sort of pretexts to push U.S. hegemony in the Muslim world, and this was very much in vogue among the neoconservatives who were in power in Bush's administration. But even after Bush, a lot of neoconservatives, they took this banner on for whatever reason, whether it was liberal international order or whatever. But the sort of the juggernaut never went away. Other governments, whether it was Obama, whether it was whether it was Tony Blair, who himself, he led a Labour government in the United Kingdom, but regardless of ideology, they sort of latched onto this. And the irony that we now see is that this has sort of torn at the political fabric of Western countries themselves. So you see the very sharp rise of this sort of xenophobic, far right sort of extremism in places like the United States and Europe. And a lot of this was sort of midwifed into respectability by the new conservatives. So you see a lot of far right like ideologues in the United States who were basically introduced to the public during the sort of anti-Muslim fervor of the 2000s. So in a way, it backfired on the West, and we see now 20 years later the geopolitical grasp of the West and the United States. It's much weaker than it was on September 10th, 2001, for example. You have Russia and China, which from a Muslim point of view, they're no friends of the Muslim countries, but you have them as well asserting themselves. You have sort of Europe and the United States sort of parting ways on a number of issues. So it's had a very, very deleterious effect in terms of political discourse, both in Muslim countries and in the United States and in Western countries. It's had a very destructive impact in the sense that any government or any faction can brand their opponents as terrorists or whatever. In places like Somalia, places like in places like Somalia and places like Yemen, we've seen sorry, not Yemen, Syria. We've seen the Syrian government, for example, waged a brutal war against its majority population, whose rationale was indistinguishable from the rationale of the United States and other Western countries, in the sense that we're fighting Islamic terrorists, we're trying to keep alcohol or whatever flowing in Damascus, things like that. So this sort of discourse that the United States started in 2001, it's been internationalized. It's been used by rival governments, including China. It's been used by a lot of Muslim states as well against their own dissidents. So it's unfortunately it was a very destructive war, and none of it really needed to happen if the United States had behaved in a more mature and less self-serving way after 9/11. They definitely they had to bring the perpetrators to justice, but they adopted such a big dragnet sort of approach and sort of exploited 9/11 for their own geopolitical purposes. And 20 years later, we see it's unraveled.
Well, certainly, Ibrahim and Sami, I think Ibrahim makes a very important point in terms of internationalized and how the U.S. war on terror has and when one looks at we touched briefly on the Muslim world, but also looking at the chain of events that had taken place over the years. And talking about things like democracy, talking about the liberal type of government that we're looking at in the and trying to install democracy in many of the Muslim lands. But all of that seems to have backfired, because the point that Ibrahim makes is a lot of governments have moved towards a right-wing agenda, a right-wing mentality. We see it in the actions. We see it right across the entire Europe as well. So having moved to this far right, at the end of the day, we see what has happened. We see what has happened not only in Iraq and in Afghanistan, but in, for instance, looking at Myanmar, looking at the Rohingya, and looking at what has taken place in Syria, the removal of Mohammed Morsi, a democratically elected president in Egypt. So much has been taking place along, but all of it as a result of 9/11, which has basically given a license or carte blanche, for want of a better term, for the world and the leadership to do as they please with their people?
I think that's one way to look at it. I think also that it's important to stress that by the time we got to the Arab Spring, which is what you're alluding with the democracy and the like, the US was already going through a process of soul searching in terms of the extent to which it should continue many of these wars. And I think that's what Obama represented. And I actually think that Obama, it was his hesitancy that puts him down as one of the worst presidents in terms of foreign policy, as opposed to any Machiavellian or conspiracies on his part. And the reason I say that is because after the war of Iraq and after the war in Afghanistan, it's important to remember that millions across Europe and even in the US protested against these wars. They protested against Afghanistan. They protested against Iraq. And Tony Blair in the UK, where I was born and raised, Tony Blair was under heavy pressure during the wars of Iraq and Afghanistan, and they haunted him until the end of his term. So, in other words, the presence of these protests, the presence of these non-Muslims who were adamantly and even today against the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, it forced some sort of at least a soul searching to take place at the top levels of power. And I think that's what Obama represented, in that when the Arab Spring took place and the Arabs took to the streets in order to establish justice and to have equal opportunity and for jobs and access to healthcare and the like, the problem for the US and the Europe was that while they are espousing the ideas of democracy and the like, the Arabs in the region chose wrong from their perspective. Macron in 2020, in November 2020, in an article in Le Grand Continent, he says that we realized that the people in the Arab Spring had chosen regressive tendencies, i.e. they chose Islamism, they chose Ikhwan Muslimin, they chose Mohammed Morsi and the like. And as a result, Obama in the US or even Merkel in Germany or the like didn't know how to deal with this, didn't know how to deal with these particular concepts. And Syria descended into chaos, not necessarily because the Americans wanted it to, but because the Americans had no idea what to do. Obama had gone into Libya, had got rid of Gaddafi at the Qataris' behest. The Qataris were lobbying heavily for NATO intervention. It wasn't the US that came storming in. Remember, Hamad bin Jassim of Qatar was the one who set up the contact group in Doha. He was lobbying Washington heavily for international intervention. When Obama went in and realized that the Libyans were descending into civil war and chaos and it had failed miserably, when it came to Syria, he wasn't prepared to prepare the same thing. But my point is saying is that there's a lot more nuance in terms of how the US foreign policy has got to the stage that it is today, as opposed to this idea of a cowboy that's suddenly gone mad and is rampaging everywhere. And I think this is why that when we're looking at the situation as it is today, it may well have been that Bush was using anti-Islamic rhetoric, using the words such as crusade, using the words such as uniting, you're either with us or against us, this idea of crusade, which was historically only really against the Muslims. It was the sort of Christian versus Muslim ideology, something that was rejected even by pop stars such as George Michael, who has a famous interview where he says, why are we following Bush into a war that is unjust, for which there should be more rationality? In other words, it was more than just this idea of a clash of civilizations that Bush wanted to represent, and many people rejected that. And I think this is what we're seeing today, in that in the defeat of Afghanistan, people are now having the blindfolds lifted and saying, wait, was it really a clash of civilizations? Was this really, as Bush was saying, this idea that there is a danger from Islam, or there is a danger from these radical Islamists? Or was it the fact that we failed to be mature, as was suggested in the Foreign Policy magazine, an article released yesterday which said that America lost the chance to really elevate itself and display its values by choosing instead arrogance and force, as opposed to rationality and actually talking about the issue in serious ways. And the reason why I mention it is because even in the Muslim rhetoric, the reality is the war on terror also had an impact on the Muslim rhetoric and the Muslim world, in that it broke the ability of Muslim organizations to ally with non-Muslim organizations who themselves were especially sincere and fighting in British courts and fighting in US courts for the Muslims who are being oppressed and tortured. Those lawyers who are fighting for justice for the Yemeni children killed in drone strikes, they were non-Muslims. Those lawyers who are fighting on behalf of those who are in Guantanamo, the like, were non-Muslims. The activists writing these reports that we rely on today to demonstrate the US's aggression were written by non-Muslims. But the war on terror broke even the rhetoric within the Muslim community, in that the alliances that perhaps historically we were so good at building, albeit under the concept of establishing dawah and promoting Islamic principles and the like, we failed to establish even that. So now we have this multipolar world that is polarized, that has created camps where we're unable to bridge and establish those ties because of the trauma that has been caused by the US power and the way it has been internalized. And to put this in relation to your question now, and I'll finish on this point, this idea of the war on terror and in the build-up and how the US really portrayed it in this Islamophobic ideas, the reality is that, that these ideas have taken root. When you go to an airport, the Muslim 9 out of 10 times is likely to be stopped. When I went to Switzerland for a holiday with my family, and I know anecdotes are very bad form, but for example, my daughter who's 4 years old, she notices that the French family in front, the guard says, bonjour, bienvenue, welcome to Switzerland. And then my wife in hijab goes forward and he goes, passports, please. So, and my daughter says, Baba, why was he nice to the family in front, but he was rude to us? And these experiences, human beings are a culmination of experiences. I've grown up in London. I've never been subject to racism, albeit other people have. I know that in London, I can go to a court and a judge won't judge me based on my color. I know if I have a dispute with a white person, I will get my justice. I've experienced this. I know this. But what the Americans did was they created this sort of Hollywood film that the world is enemies with one another, that the Muslim is the bogeyman, and the Muslim responded by saying that the American is the bogeyman. So much so, and again I finish on an anecdote which I know is bad form. There is an American lady on my Facebook, she wrote a very good post where she said, I know the world hates us, I know the world hates Americans, but I swear to you, we Americans resent what our government did. We resent what Bush did. We resent what American foreign policy has come to be about. We resent the drone strike program. Please humanize us. And for people like us who've been dehumanized, I know it's hard to rehumanize the one who dehumanized us. But I think that we should be responsible in the lessons that we learned from the war in Afghanistan. The US failed. The US were defeated. But the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam was not a man of revenge. He was a man who went to Mecca, opened it, and used the likes of Muawiyah and Amr ibn al-As and Khalid ibn Walid, these great titans who went on to contribute to civilization. And this is why I think the greatest thing that we can do moving forward is how we alter that rhetoric, how we start talking in terms of accountability, but talking to it in a broad term, as Alex was doing earlier with this idea of talking about how can we establish accountability as opposed to how we can establish revenge. These are two very different things, and I think perhaps that needs to be reflected more in rhetoric. I know I'm speaking general terms and in broad terms, but I think this is a very valuable point. Otherwise, if we keep looking at it through the security lens and keep looking at it through the victimization lens and keep looking at it through the aggressive lens, we will repeat the mistakes of the past. We will never be able to move forward. And the reality is that now that the US is no longer the hegemon that it was, opportunities are now available that the world can take to really move forward. Of course, it might not happen in our generation or the generation after, but the world is changing, the tectonic plates are changing, but is our rhetoric changing? And I think that's something that we should focus on as well.
Yes, Sami, just before I get to Andy, I know you're going to leave us in the next few minutes, and obviously you're up for time. Just final thoughts before we take leave of you.
I think that with regards to Afghanistan, the reality is that while it's celebrated as a victory against the Americans, we should also be very well aware in that it can go badly wrong as well. Let's remember that even from the Muslim perspective, the Taliban were condemned in terms of their approach to women's rights, in terms of their approach to women's education. Even within the Muslim world, there was this debate perhaps that in Islam we have Aisha radiallahu anha and Hafsa radiallahu anha and all these other famous women scholars and the like that serve as a model that the Taliban approach during the 1990s towards women was not the correct approach by Islamic standards. And this is why I think it has the potential to go badly wrong, in that if the Taliban go back to those policies, then Muslims like myself who see Aisha radiallahu anha and Hafsa radiallahu anha and read about her in the history books are suddenly put under pressure, and it fuels that right-wing Islamophobia. The second point that's important to remember is that Qatar, which is the prime interlocutor with the Taliban, was also the prime interlocutor with the Muslim Brotherhood. And we know how that went. There was a euphoria when they came to power. There was this idea that they were dominant. They had won democratic elections. They were in charge of the state. And within 2 years, Sisi has done a coup in Egypt. And now that has fallen from power. Libya has descended into civil war. And Yemen has descended into civil war. And Syria has ended up into chaos. In other words, the euphoria of today may not be the euphoria of 2-3 years. It's also important to remember that the Afghans have beaten a colonial power before. They beat the Soviets and still fell into civil war. They beat the Soviets and still failed to come to some sort of dialogue and come reconciliation. The reality is that governance is harder than resistance. National reconciliation is harder than fighting an open enemy. This is the time where it really gets hard. This is the time where it really becomes very difficult. And this is why I think that rather than celebrating being exuberant at the defeat of the Americans, which is something to celebrate, I agree. The reality is that we should not take our eye off the ball, and we should appreciate that tough times are ahead, and we need to start talking about how we're going to move forward, not how we're going to stay backwards.
Well, shukran for that, Sami, and wonderful that you were able to join us. And even though,
Thank you for having me. Thank you for having me. Thank you.
It's been wonderful having you with us, and all the best to you. Inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
Yes, Andy, we're going to continue with you. And I think Sami made a number of points. And one of the key issues here he mentioned is accountability. And you having documented so much of these atrocities, particularly looking at the prison systems. And as Sami mentioned, it's not about revenge. We've seen the immediate reaction on the part of the Taliban as well, where, you know, they've been talking about reconciliation. They haven't been talking about revenge. They've been talking about pardoning those who even went against them. And I think at this point in time, obviously, when one looks at trying to move forward, particularly for a country like Afghanistan, in the absence of revenge, but accountability is still critical. So, you know, we had this in South Africa. We had, after the fall of apartheid, we had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where a lot had basically come out. So I think at the end of the day, just your thoughts, your views on accountability now that the United States of America is gone and they've left Afghanistan. But at the end of the day, somebody needs still to be held accountable.
Accountability within Afghanistan amongst all the different organizations. Is that what you're talking about?
Well, not only in Afghanistan, but I'm just looking at the global powers as well, the coalition of the willing that had gone into Afghanistan, because there are many that are questioning the fact that we don't even know why we were there in the first place.
Yes, well, no, absolutely. I mean, I think the problem with war, when you step back and look at it, is how devastatingly ruinous and pointless it is. Does it just reveal something so fundamentally bloodthirsty at the heart of so many powerful human beings' motivations? Because the parallels between the United States leaving Afghanistan and the United States leaving Vietnam are very similar in the sense of, what was that about? You went halfway around the world, you slaughtered hundreds of thousands or millions of people, and then you walked away having won nothing. So, you know, I'm very disturbed about those notions, and I would love to think, and I don't want to sound fanciful here, that maybe the United States will have a period of reflection about exactly what it thinks its purpose is in the world. But, you know, the United States people consistently elect people to lead and represent them who fundamentally back the military-industrial complex that, you know, that soaks up so much of the United States wealth and has put that into war. And that has been going on over and over and over again. This is the last 20 years is just the latest phase of American warmongering. American people don't generally realize that if you visit that country from another country, then you can generally see that this is a country that's falling apart because it's been bled dry by the greed of its own military-industrial complex. The insane amounts of money that are spent, and none of that goes, you know, that is all taken from the people. If we look at what China has been doing for the last, throughout all of this period, China goes into countries and says, you have minerals that we want. What deal can we do? What would you like from us? War isn't involved. And, you know, and looking at Afghanistan, what's going to be very interesting is seeing how the Taliban, if they are going to manage to rule the country that they represent 40% of the people of, if they are going to be able to do that, then, you know, they will have to be coming up with deals with other countries. And it seems like, you know, China would be the head of that list. But on accountability for the issues involved in the war on terror that relate to the crimes that took place on the part of the United States and their allies, then I have always believed that one day there needs to be some kind of accountability for what's happened. Now, part of the problem has been that Guantanamo has limped on in its pointless existence, warehousing a smaller and smaller number of people for absolutely no good reason whatsoever for so long. And that actually issues of accountability can only really start to become something that is practicable when the prison is finally closed. So, one of the problems that we have with Guantanamo, and very, very clearly that we have with Guantanamo, is that the men who were held at Guantanamo and who were designated as enemy combatants, who were stripped of all their rights as human beings when they were captured, have continued to have no rights as human beings, even when they're released. So if you're released back to your home country, or if you're someone like the Yemenis, where the entire US establishment has agreed that it's not safe to repatriate you and so has had to find a third country in which to resettle you, you have no rights as a human being. Any rights that you might think you have are fluid. Anything can evaporate if the United States government decides that that you still constitute some kind of threat. If your home government decides that they think you constitute some kind of threat. If your host country doesn't like you. There is no body of legislation, nothing at all to provide rights, human rights, basic rights to any of these people. They are at the whim of still the United States government and their home government and the government of a third country, if that's the case. Now, at some point, this needs examining. And part of the problem is that we've seen some terrible things happen over the years with people who were resettled from Guantanamo who weren't sent home. So the most notorious example is that between 2015 and 2017, President Obama sent nearly 24 men, mostly Yemenis, to the United Arab Emirates on the promise that the UAE would hold them for a bit in the kind of rehabilitation program and then would enable them to rebuild their lives. Well, those men are still imprisoned arbitrarily in abusive conditions to rival what they previously experienced at Guantanamo. 6 of them were recently forcibly sent back to Yemen, where they have been reunited with their families, but they're back in a very dangerous war zone situation in their home countries. But the other men are still held in the UAE, abused by the Emirati government with no rights. They have no rights. And trying to act on this is obviously very difficult because the problem is with the Emirati government. And it's part of a bigger issue of how we address how the prisoners at Guantanamo have been held. And that's the reason that I say it kind of needs Guantanamo itself to be resolved before we can start saying to the United States government, you need to remove from all of these people the stigma of having been held as enemy combatants, which means that uniquely on Earth, they don't have rights. And, and we need to start eventually being able to look into issues of reparations. These things have happened before. When massive injustices like the internment of Japanese Americans in World War II took place, for example, it took the United States government a long time to have a reckoning with itself about what it had done. And I think that that's still the issue with Guantanamo. But as I say, the crucial thing at the moment is still not to rock the boat regarding the men who are still held there. And the sad thing about Guantanamo is that there are men still held at Guantanamo who have done nothing. Really, they're kind of the lowliest foot soldiers in Afghanistan. There are still some of those men held there. Now, they made up hundreds of the population of Guantanamo over the years. But there are still a handful of them who are still held there. And they're held there not because of anything that they allegedly did before they got to Guantanamo, but because in Guantanamo, they have inconvenienced the authorities by resisting the unjust basis of their imprisonment, through hunger strikes, through organizing their fellow prisoners to resist. That is why some of the 39 men that are still held at Guantanamo are there. It's that and that alone. And I'm just, you know, I'm ashamed that the United States government constantly kicks Guantanamo somewhere, you know, down the road, because dealing with it is difficult, because as soon as anybody who wants to deal with it tries to, then the Republicans leap on it as a way that they can attack the Democrats and apparently show them as being weak. How are we going to get resolution for the men that are still held there so that we can move on to the next step of saying to the United States, you invented a category of human beings without rights. How dare you? That is a completely unacceptable thing to do. And it needs to be addressed.
Thank you for that, Andy. Taji, to bring you back into the discussion now, we are talking about accountability, and often we hear that, you know, without accountability, we can't have closure of a chapter. And we've seen 20 years later, $2 trillion later, you spoke about capitalism. And when we're talking about accountability, we're not talking only about the United States of America. We're talking about those that had supported, that had landed support to the United States of America. And we're not only talking about Afghanistan, we're talking about Iraq, for instance. And Iraq, we've seen what Tony Blair had said. He lied about weapons of mass destruction. But those that had supported people like Tony Blair, those that had supported the likes of Donald Rumsfeld and George Bush and everybody else as well, we're talking about the Arab governments, those that had made their bases available, their military bases, for the United States of America to do what they had done in Iraq as well, where we've seen millions. So at the end of the day, when we're talking accountability, we're talking about accountability not only, as I said, the United States, but many of the world leadership that had basically supported the United States of America.
Indeed. You know, I'll tell you something. In the last few days, I initially got upset hearing Tony Blair. And then actually, there's a part of me that thinks, yes, let Blair speak. Let Tony Blair speak. Upset on one hand because Tony Blair is a man who sent people into war. He's a man who speaks so eloquently and paints Islam as being the enemy. He's a man who tries to rally Western public opinion, other governments, in his, they call it war on terror, the war on Islam. But you know, in the last few days when he speaks, I think he should speak some more. Because the fact that this warmonger, this murderer, is walking the streets of Western capitals and traveling around the world, and he's not in jail, it actually makes the point very clear to anybody with eyes and ears that justice will not come from Western government who started the so-called war on terror. That it is impossible. That their standards change. They speak about justice, they speak about human rights, freedom of speech, women's rights. In reality, they contradict these same concepts every day. So it is the law of the jungle in the world that we face. And that's a reality of man-made law when parliaments and senates make laws. What is in America's interest to be able to go somewhere and get its hand on resources? It will do it, regardless of the rights, the wrongs of it. So the Muslim world, I think the Muslim Ummah, our Muslims who are listening to this, we need to step up to the plate. Justice cannot come from the current world that we have today. It cannot come from looking at the US, the UN, the UK governments. Justice will come when we as Muslims have our own independent political authority and we show the world what justice is. So justice for the victims in Iraq and Afghanistan, the Muslim world, will come when there is a government that will defend them. A government that would say to any warmongering Western government, if you touch my people, if you send your drones, if you send your men, your blood, your treasure to come and fight us, we will not roll over, we will defend ourselves. That's what the Prophet ﷺ, peace be upon him, did. That's what the Khulafa did. The Islamic State, the Islamic Khilafah State's job is to implement Islam and to defend Muslims. Today, in the absence of that, there is no justice in the Muslim world. And even in the Western world, there is no justice. So justice will come by Muslims having a strong power to defend themselves. And secondly, that power, the way it deals with the world, will become a new beacon, a new example. There are so many examples from Islamic history of the Khilafah, of Imam Ali radiallahu anh, of many rulers who were taken to court by non-Muslim citizens of the Islamic State, who said, you violated your law, you violated your Sharia law. You accusing me in a court that I stole something and you've got no proof. The Sharia says you've got to have proof. and the judge finds in favor of the non-Muslim citizen of the Islamic State, who ends up embracing Islam because he thinks, wow, this is justice. So the way we will deal with other countries, with other people who are friendly towards us, who are not aggressive towards us, we'll have relations. The Khilafah will have relations, inshallah. The Muslim world will have relations with, maybe Norway and Sweden and countries that are not sending their armies. Countries like the UK and America, our relations have to be very calculated. Are we going to have relations whilst you're sending drone strikes on us? So I think justice is a concept which everybody likes and everybody thinks, yeah, would like to have justice, but there's a practical question. How do you establish justice in a world? And I would argue only Islam has the track record, the Islamic Khilafah State has the track record, has the beliefs. Because for us, when we follow the laws of the Creator, which is what establishes justice, we don't follow it one day because we think it's good to follow, and the next day, when we're attacked on 9/11, we're attacked by some foreign power, we then decide we're going to go across the world, we're going to kidnap innocent people, we're going to take them to a place called Guantanamo, we're going to ravage them, we're going to kill them, we're going to murder people. I mean, the world becomes a jungle, and you create more hatred. And this is the mess we have today. So really, I look forward to the day an Islamic power will return the Khilafah state. We have an opportunity in the world today. And Muslims have to step up to the plate, believe in that, call for that unity, call for the Khilafah, so we become an example of justice for the world and can truly defend ourselves in this so-called war and terror. I want to finish on Moises' point. He made a very good point, a very good reminder to us. Some people wonder, why do you say it's a war in Islam? Because before 9/11, with the demise of the Soviet Union, the Western powers, I stress, Western powers, not Western people. The Western masses don't really understand what's going on, unfortunately. But the head of corporations, the elite, those in parliament in the UK and elsewhere, they are people who, when they look to the world, they see interest. They see the oil in the Muslim world. They see our oil. We're like a petrol station. They just want to go there and grab the oil. They see the resources. They see our lands, which are fertile. They see a place they can dominate and gain resources from. And they see that the only thing that stands in their way is if people in the Muslim world, like in the past, are united and live by their deen, their ideology, their Islam, that will protect them, defend them, help them to look after themselves, and then to be a beacon carrying da'wah, carrying the justice of Islam to the world. So Islam became the target. When 9/11 came along, it became a fantastic excuse to go after and to target any idea, anywhere where there's any idea that Muslims might unite and be an example, we've got to go after it. So that's the point Ibrahim made earlier, that before 9/11, the idea that Islam might rise as a power somewhere was in the mind of thinkers and policymakers in the West, not the Western public. I really want to stress this point. The Western public really don't know any better, sadly, but the Western elite have targeted Islam, and 9/11 became that excuse. So until we're united under our own political steam, the Khilafah state, establish justice in our lands, defend ourselves, that will then become a beacon of justice for other people in the way we deal with the world with true justice, as happened for over 1,300 years of our history.
Well, shukran for the Taji. The time is just gone 8 p.m. We're going to go for a quick break. We'll be back in a few minutes.
Listen to Salam Media.
Reliable access to clean water could save thousands of lives each day. With proper sanitation and easy access to fresh, clean water, communities can flourish. Our Thirst Relief Appeal provides clean water to communities in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East by building deep wells and providing sustainable water and hygiene solutions. A monthly donation of as little as 700 Rand could build a well for a community in need. That's only 23 Rand a day. Donate today. www.pennyappeal.org.za or call 031 11 00 573. Penny Appeal. Small change, big difference.
What makes Randery Jewelers the optimum place for your memorable gift? Is it our range of exclusive, high-end, luxurious jewellery? Or is it our master craftsmanship of all your bespoke jewellery needs? We believe it's because at Randery Jewelers, we know just how to make your special moments last forever. Whether it's for a wedding, anniversary, or just a simple gift to show your love, trust Randery Jewelers to make it special. www.randeryjewelers.com. Make your moments last forever with Randery Jewelers, the family name you can trust.
The following political party advertisement has been paid for by the party concerned.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Peace and blessings be upon all. My name is Imran Musa from the Al Jamaa Party. I am currently a councillor for Ward 9 in Lenasia. Vote Al Jamaa in the coming local elections for us to continue to serve you to the best of our ability. You must have seen the huge impact and felt the difference we are already making in the community. As your beloved councillor Imran Musa of Lenasia, you're most welcome to contact me on 082-805-1368 for any service delivery queries. #I love Lenasia.
Babu, why don't you loosen your belt a bit more?
But why now?
Well, it's very tight, blocking air to your brain.
Haju, this is only a start. I need to tighten up a bit more. Funds are tight and the cost of living is high.
Funds are not tight. It's your haram insurance which is tightening our barakat.
Okay, Haju. I will call my insurance friend tomorrow.
Maybe I must tighten up on my cooking from now on too.
No, Haju, we don't need to tighten up. It's okay. Look, I'm even throwing away my belt.
Don't tighten your belt. Change your insurance. Leaving Riba Insurance is easier than you think. Call Amana IFS for all your personal and commercial takaful needs. 0861 786 393. Amana. Leave Riba for good. Amana IFS is a registered financial services provider.
Salam Media, a global voice for humanity.
The time is just gone 3 minutes past 8 p.m. as we continue with our panel discussion this evening. And our focus this evening, if you have just tuned in, is reflections on 9/11 and impact on Afghanistan and the rest of the Muslim world. And we have got Taji Mustafa, we've got Andy Worthington and Ibrahim Moise, who are all part of the panel this evening. And we're going to go now to Ibrahim Moise. Ibrahim, looking at the geopolitics of the region and just looking at the Southeast Asian region, looking at countries like Pakistan. Now, we know Pakistan has obviously impacted quite a bit. The consequences as a result of 9/11, the war on terror, the invasion of Afghanistan has impacted quite heavily on Pakistan to the extent that at one point in time, under the leadership of the likes of Pervez Musharraf, were active partners in the United States of America and their ambitions as far as Afghanistan had gone. And also, Andy's been talking about Guantanamo Bay, we're talking about the black hole sites, we're talking about the prison systems, and to a large extent, we've seen Pakistan under Musharraf obviously having supported the United States of America. But over a period of time, things obviously have changed a bit different under the Imran Khan government. And just looking at Pakistan in itself and, understanding the dynamics that are playing out in Pakistan and with the return of the Taliban, how is this likely to impact on Pakistan? And we know that also in terms of its relationship, in terms of foreign policy, the Pakistan pretty closely aligned to China.
Yeah. So thanks. So with Pakistan, you have to look at the sort of the historical background. Pakistan played it played probably from foreign countries the biggest role in the Afghanistan war of the 1980s, at which time they were allied with the West against the Soviets. In the 1990s, certainly by the mid 1990s, Pakistan were one of the only governments that recognized the Taliban movement, and they were recruits and financial support and things like that coming from Pakistan. So there was a lot of important, in particular diplomatic support by Pakistan to the Taliban, and it's important to remember that initially when Musharraf took over in 1999, he himself continued this before 2001. So I think 90% of the generals who took part in his government early on, in his coup and in his early military elite, they were very open sympathizers of the Taliban. A few of them, even after they were retired from the army, continued to fundraise and do things like that for the Taliban. What happened in 2001 was basically Pakistan had been the only country from the region supporting the Taliban. That includes, Iran, India, Russia. These countries were all supporting the Taliban's enemies. So Pakistan was it was basically sort of vulnerable, and so Musharraf, he sort of switched sides, you could say. He there's a famous stories of him having sent innocent people to American custody and things like that. And basically, the rationale was that America is like a wounded bear, and if we don't listen to them, if we don't play along with them, we're going to be next on their menu. So even at that point, though, it was more of like an arm twisted decision by the by the Pakistani government, and in fact, Musharraf purged a lot of people who had originally supported him because they were too close to the Taliban. But he also kept the Taliban, in places like Quetta and stuff like that, sort of as insurance, because the incoming Afghan government, led by Karzai and people like that, it was not a government that Pakistan was necessarily very comfortable with. They didn't trust it. And originally Pakistan, they sort of played along with this, but because the new government was close to India, they sort of reached into their back pocket and started helping the Taliban again. The Taliban have often been, they've been sort of unfairly portrayed as Pakistan's puppets, but they continued, their political activity and their military activity, even when Pakistan was not supporting them. In recent years, obviously, Pakistan itself was hurt quite badly by the American war in Afghanistan. It sort of, Musharraf's gamble or whatever you want to call it, it sort of backfired, and in the end, the Americans ditched him too. So Pakistan has been increasingly close to China. Pakistan has always been close to China, but now it's more as a sort of an anti-American insurance. So Pakistan definitely played a big diplomatic role for the Taliban in their, in the last 2 or 3 years. In trying to bring them to the negotiating table, trying to get countries to recognize them. At the same time, they're not willing sort of to jump into the water ahead of anybody else. So they're not willing to stick their necks out. So for that reason, they haven't yet recognized the Taliban. They're waiting for one of the big countries to do so, and for the government to stabilize. So it'll be interesting to see if Pakistan, if they sort of continue this sort of collaboration or whatever with the Taliban. It is important to note that India is extremely hostile to the Taliban, almost to the point of irrationality. There's been an enormous amount of misinformation in the last 3-4 months by India, which some of the old Afghan government also picked up on. And the reason is that they see the Taliban and Pakistan as sort of being in cahoots against India's interests. And the current Indian government is also very anti-Muslim as a rule, and for them, like the Taliban are very easy boogeyman. So it's almost ideological, their stance on Afghanistan. So maybe that'll force Pakistan and the Taliban to collaborate. But Pakistan's stance has generally been that the Taliban should be part of the Afghan government without being the entire Afghan government. Because in the past that didn't work out. It didn't work out for the Taliban, obviously, because there was a war continuing. But from Pakistan's point of view, it didn't work out either, because a lot of the Taliban's enemies, they jumped into India's camp. So Pakistan is sort of trying to trying to play off, sort of fence sitting, you could say, and sort of trying to bring different sides together.
Yes, shukran for that. Andy, if you could unmute your mic, please. Now, just looking at Afghanistan at this point in time, and recently we've been hearing about the Taliban having evolved, okay? And looking at the Taliban in 2001 that was basically taken out of power, and the Taliban that has now returned to power in 2021, we're seeing quite a big difference. In fact, we've seen it in the immediate aftermath of the takeover of Kabul. We've seen them a lot more media savvy, a lot more engaging. And just looking at the Taliban as they are at this point in time, and we know that despite the United States of America having spent over $2 trillion on a war that they never succeeded in 20 years, but very little in terms of development has taken place in Afghanistan. And for a country, for the Taliban to succeed as a government, what should they be doing?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because when you said that, it just made me think that, you know, that this is what the United States does. Whatever its development aims during war could be, they end up destroying them because war is just so destructive. So, you know, I was thinking while we were having discussions earlier about Iraq, certainly one of the reasons that the neocons wanted to invade Iraq was to try and secure Iraq's oil. But, you know, the entire Iraq escapade failed. Afghanistan has failed. And what has the United States got out of it? It seems nothing. I mean, they've left with nothing. Here is a fractious but mineral-rich country. And I would be extremely surprised if it isn't the Chinese who do as they've been doing while the United States has been engaged in its pointless wars. Which is, you know, as I mentioned earlier, that they turn up at a negotiating table and say, you have resources that we would very much like. What is it that we can pay for in return that you need? So, you know, I would be expecting that that's what's going to happen. And of course, geopolitically, once America removes itself from a place that it is difficult to be in and has no right to be in, the same has happened with Vietnam, really. Then it becomes a matter of who is geopolitically actually on the ground. Who are the countries that neighbor this country, Afghanistan, rather than issues dealing with a foreign invader who's flown halfway around the world to do so. So, you know, the other questions that we all have to look at about this are going to be what the role of Iran is, for example, if there is a role for Iran in this. And, you know, it's going to be very interesting. I mean, I'm intrigued that what we've already seen in Ayat with the Taliban is that, of course, some of the leaders of the Taliban were living in Doha, were living in Qatar for many years. You know, we've already seen that the ISIS offshoot in Afghanistan, which is opposed to them, regards them basically as being old and soft and not extreme enough because of this. These are men who, you know, I can sympathize. I think we're probably the same age. I'm in my late 50s. I think many of these guys are. These are not young firebrands. They're not the young firebrands that they were when the Taliban first rose in the 1990s. And, you know, and they're also trying to take control of a country that, although it, you know, is still racked with huge amounts of poverty, has experienced some input of money over the last 20 years, and has also, you know, been subject to the changes that the rest of the world has been subjected to. The entire world is now, you know, connected by mobile phones in a way that simply didn't exist 20 years ago. So, you know, I'm intrigued by the challenges that we see, and you know, and I hope very much for the people of Afghanistan that some kind of responsibility is taken by the Taliban to try and include everybody, because, you know, as we know, but as shockingly it seems the Americans didn't necessarily realize, there are many different ethnic groups within Afghanistan. The Taliban, you know, representing the Pashtuns, make up the largest proportion at around 40% of the population, but the Hazara, who have been subjected to extreme violence by the Taliban over the years, and Uzbeks and Tajiks make up most of the population of Afghanistan. And given the different groups, that's always why it's historically been so difficult to get some kind of unity. And obviously part of that is down to the arbitrary drawing of borders back in the days when the British Empire would draw lines over a world map and you know, and not care about the problems that would ensue. I hope that that with the US mission having failed so resoundingly after 20 years, that the people of Afghanistan can put together something that will benefit the people of Afghanistan themselves. They deserve it. This is, you know, they have been racked with warfare externally and internally for over 40 years, and they deserve peace and a chance to try and rebuild their lives. And I hope the Taliban will lead in trying to establish that.
Thank you, Brother Danny. Yes, Taji.
Do you permit me just to come? There's a point that Ibrahim raised, and there's a point that Andy raised, and there's 2 points in my mind. If I could address that. Ibrahim made a lot of points, very pertinent points about Pakistan and the role of Pakistan. And again, I want to stress, when I say Pakistan, I mean its leadership. I mean its elite. I mean the Musharrafs of this world, the prime ministers, Bajwa, defense chiefs. And I think one thing was never, ever, ever be forgotten in this whole episode, this disastrous episode. The men, women, children, the people going to wedding parties, the farmers in their fields, killed and murdered by Western soldiers sent from halfway around the world. One of the greatest facilitators that made this possible was Musharraf and those around him in the Pakistani leadership. As Ibrahim said, I remember very clearly after 9/11 that there were corps commanders, in charge of some of the corps of the Pakistani military who had to be removed, because when America came along to Musharraf seeking his help, they were not comfortable. We can't help a power from across the world invade Afghanistan, invade our people. They saw themselves as one. Their sentiments, partly influenced by their Islam, said no to this. And Musharraf told a lie to the Pakistani people. And that lie was, if we don't do what America says, America's going to send us back to the Stone Age. Well, 20 years later, a few men with Kalashnikovs in Afghanistan have shown that they were able to stand up against America and Britain and all the might of their so-called military machine, which we were told was invincible. Pakistan is a nuclear-armed power, hundreds of thousands of soldiers under arms, a well-trained, not a Mickey Mouse military, a well-trained military machine. And at that time, Pakistan could simply have said, what happened in 9/11 was bad, but now you want me to help you to invade and kill and murder next door? Can't do that. And I would argue very strongly that the Americans, what could the Americans have done? Fly missions halfway around the world, but instead, by handing over the keys, oil, resources flowed through Pakistan in order to allow the murderous American and British occupation of Afghanistan. So if you stand strong, you can stand against any power. That's a lesson for all Muslims, lesson for all Muslim nations. And if you stay with America and you help her against your own people, Pakistan has suffered, has lost people, thousands and thousands of people, tens of thousands in the so-called war on terror. Not our war on terror, America's war on terror. So this is a lesson for all those agents, and America will use them for as long as it wants. And then Musharraf, where is Musharraf today? He's a nobody. And today in Pakistan, unfortunately, we still have government in charge in Pakistan. I know people who were disappeared in Pakistan in the last few days, taken off the streets because they call for Islam, they call for Islamic unity. They say we should help the Afghans. So that's the point regarding Pakistan. It could play a very important role today in Afghanistan, but not at the behest of America. Second point, America has left Afghanistan. How is America going to be close to try to influence issues in Afghanistan? Through proxies, through the Pakistani leadership, through the Qatari leadership. So my advice to our brothers and sisters in Afghanistan, when the Pakistani leadership wants to hug you close, or the Qataris want to hug you and say they're helping you, you have to ask questions. Who are they really helping? They're not helping the Pakistani people. Many of the elite in these countries are in the pockets, are helping a foreign power, the US, the UK, against their own people. My third point, the future. Andy mentioned that, we all want a better future for Afghanistan. It's not going to come from looking to the US and the UK. It's not going to come from these hypocrites regimes in London that talk about women's rights. I live in London. Big demonstration down the road from here when one woman was murdered. So many women came out saying how they don't feel safe on the streets of London, even with the police. Thousands of women. So the harassment, the daily harassment of women in the UK, murder of women, don't come and lecture us Muslims in a Muslim country about human rights and freedom. You can't even look after your people. People are hungry in the streets of the UK. Well, the 6th largest economy in the world. So we can't look to the West. We can't look to capitalism and its failure. We have to look to our history. We have to look to our deen. And Islam is the only thing with the track record. Islam as a comprehensive way of life is the only thing with a track record. The Taliban say they made mistakes in the past. That's what they're saying now. We say to them, now the way we should judge and help each other, look to Islam. Your priority should be to implement Islam, because through that, Allah's help will come. Your priority should be calling for Muslim unity. Reach out to the Muslims of Pakistan, of Uzbekistan, of the neighbor. Reach out to Muslims globally. Reach out to the Ummah. I've got problems. I'm now running Afghanistan. How do I feed people? How do I manage an economy? In Islam, all the answers are there. I have a bookshelf here. One of the books I'm studying right now is called Amwal fil Dawlat al-Khilafah. Funds in the Islamic State. How did the Prophet state, sallallahu alaihi wasallam? How did the Khilafah? What are the forms of taxation? Ushur, Haraj, Jizya. What are the forms of distributing it? What is public property? What is private? The details of economic, social, political life is in Islam, was implemented for 1300 years. So advice to the Taliban today, don't look to the West and international recognition, because they will put pressure on you to follow their way. Don't look to the East. Look to your religion. Look to that which will come with Allah's help. And that's the Islamic Khilafah system. That's the project you should announce to the Ummah. And the Ummah will support. It's a duty on me and all Muslims to work with them for a better future. A future with an Islamic future. And that means having an Islamic project, the Khilafah project. Anything short of that, the nation state, we just want to look after Afghanistan. We will follow the West. We will. The West is not working. Capitalism is not working. Look to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Look to the Khulafa Rashida. Call upon your ummah, and Allah's help will come. So what you've achieved in the battlefield is great. Now is a real challenge. We're here to help you.
Yes, Ibrahim. To bring you into the discussion now, I see there's a few questions and there's a few comments that have come through from some of the listeners, and this one comes from Abu Bakr Abdul Hadi, who talks about saying, my candid advice is that we look at Afghanistan as a local issue, not a global victory. The group like Boko Haram were initially inspired by the Taliban, are today monsters by Islamic standards, and they should be defeated. Thank God they are surrendering in doves in Nigeria. But the key issue here is, I mean, can Afghanistan be looked as a local issue and not a global issue, considering that the invasion of Afghanistan has impacted on the rest of the world? And we discussed it right at the beginning on how the impact has been felt right across the entire world as a result of the war on terror.
Well, I'll just tell a quick story that's pertinent to this. My friend a few weeks ago, he said, he said to me, you've been studying these sort of obscure peasant mullahs and commanders or whatever in Afghanistan, and now now they're sort of now they're making news and things like that. But the thing is that Afghanistan, it's I don't think you can separate the local and the international that easily. So definitely in Afghanistan and anywhere in the world really, the local issues sort of take priority in the sense that if you want to see how development or how just issues in towns and villages, very day-to-day things, administration, things like that. Obviously, local politics, local dynamics have a strong role to play in that. You can't govern any place if you don't know how the local society works. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that it doesn't have international repercussions when you're fighting a power like the United States or like the Soviets before that, people take notice, and as you say, the Afghanistan war was the first one in the war on terror. So if the war in Afghanistan has ended, then people might say, what are we still doing? Fighting wars in places like, I don't know, like Syria, Somalia, Libya, things like that. Not all of these are to do with terrorism, quote unquote, per se, but a lot of them are influenced by the war on terror. So the international issue is definitely there, but I think just common sense. I think local factors always take a precedence. So something like the Taliban, it stems very much from an Afghan, sort of the rural Afghan culture in which most of the Taliban were, brought up or grew up. It's not the sort of thing that you can easily copy paste and transmit it to I don't know, Nigeria or Libya or something. In fact, some of the extremist groups, and when I say extremist, I don't mean extremist from the standpoint of war on terror. I mean extremist from the standpoint of Islam, in the sense that sort of doing un-Islamic things in order to take power. Some of these groups, they were very fond of, citing the Taliban or similar before them, the Afghan Mujahideen, sort of as their role models. But the problem was that they didn't, they looked to the international aspect and they didn't look to the local aspect. So you have to look at both aspects. If definitely, like, in Pakistan, there's a lot of people, who are celebrating, like Brother Taji said, who are, they're celebrating or they're supportive of the United States being basically humiliated in Afghanistan. While support and such things are good, and it's important to have aspirations and sort of goals that are independent, like Taji said, independent of the East and the West. But it's also important to look at the specific dynamics. So, the world is a very diverse place, and even if we look through Islamic history, a place like Iraq during the Abbasi Khilafah, it was very, very different from a place like Egypt during the same period, or a place like Spain. The caliphate or the Khilafah was sort of an umbrella. It was sort of an umbrella coalition for Muslims, and there were very many cases where there were like amirs or sultans or regional commanders or regional elites who fought each other or who did injustices in spite of the Khilafah. In some cases, because of the Khilafah, and people who know Islamic history, they'll know of cases like Ahmad bin Hanbal, who was basically one of many scholars who was tortured by a very powerful and a very geopolitically impressive Abbasi Khilafah. But at the same time, that government was at that time a very unjust one. It was a government that it imprisoned people, it tortured people without cause, basically for political reasons. So I'm sort of digressing here, but my point is that it is definitely I agree with the Brother Taji about the fact that Muslims have to sort of band together and find a solution which is based in Islam, of course, which works for us, and not be subservient to the United States or to China or any other major geopolitical bloc. Independence basically is a very fundamental part of this. But at the same time, it's also important to do things. Something like the Taliban, it's not even assured right now if they're going to control Afghanistan. Like you guys said, governing is a sort of a different prospect to fighting. They've actually had a very effective, shadow government at the local level for a while, but it'll be interesting to see. Like Andy says, the world of 2021 and the Afghanistan of 2021 is not the same as the world of 2001. So the Taliban are definitely going to have to engage with other society more than they did in the past. Certainly, I just have a quick side point. And Andy mentioned, like the Pashtuns and the Tajiks and those bits, but it is important to note that the Taliban have, quite a lot of non-Pashtuns. I would say probably close to 30 to 40% of the Taliban are non-Pashtuns, and they're not a specifically ethnic group. So they've most of their fighting in the last 10 years definitely has been against other Pashtun groups, usually militias or soldiers who were hired by the United States. So that was just a caveat. But my point is that you have to look at these local factors as well as the international factors. I don't think they can be easily separated, but when you're you can't have growth or coordination internationally if you can't govern internally. And this doesn't just go for Afghanistan; it goes for any number of Muslim countries. It doesn't just go for the Taliban. The Mujahideen before them, they defeated the Soviets, and it was a very impressive military victory. But they fell into infighting amongst themselves. So because of that, they weren't sort of able to expand even across the entirety of Afghanistan, let alone their foreign relations. So definitely the international aspect, the coordination of Muslim countries, and friendly relations, obviously, with non-Muslim countries. These things are important, but you have to know how to walk before you can run, and you have to always take the local thing. You always have to keep it in mind before you can sort of get to the international stage.
Yes, Shukran for that. Andy, just looking at the Taliban now, obviously the Taliban has been making the right noises in terms of reaching out to the world and we see a very different attitude that is being adopted by the Taliban. The key issue here is there still appears to be hesitancy on the part of the world in accepting the Taliban. And most recently, we even heard about the Taliban saying that they will establish diplomatic relationships with all countries except for Israel. And that was a statement that had basically come out. Now, with the Taliban making these type of noises and the right noises, there still is this hesitancy. And just to understand what some of the underlying issues could be on the part of the rest of the world, is it a wait-and-see game, or why is there some sort of skepticism still surrounding the Taliban?
Yes. Well, I suppose the problem at the moment for a lot of the world is that they're looking at a situation where Afghanistan fell very quickly to the Taliban in essentially a military context, that, you know, into the void left by the Americans. The Taliban advanced, you know, more swiftly than many people had expected, and have now, you know, made the first step towards international recognition by forming a government, you know, which was just announced, I believe that was yesterday. Yeah. But the problem, as I see it, for international recognition is that this is not a government that represents all of the people of Afghanistan. And so the problem that I foresee, if the Taliban doesn't move to a position where it incorporates all the other ethnicities within Afghanistan, all the other groups of people, is that it will continue to have a problem with international recognition. But more importantly, it will have a problem within Afghanistan itself, one of legitimacy, which, you know, would suggest to me that Afghanistan's problems that have plagued it so much over the years, the issue that has been described tonight as a problem of governing rather than fighting, could come back and plague this poor country again. Because look back to Afghanistan's history, right back to the 19th century, when the Afghan people got rid of the British, when the Afghans got rid of the Soviet Union. Now the Afghan people have got rid of the United States, but out of what should be a position of victory, we saw, most particularly in the early 90s, how Afghanistan degenerated into the most horrible civil war between all of the different factions that were involved. And, you know, I'm really desperate for the Afghan people who you know, ordinary Afghan people have suffered so much over 42 years of invasions and conquest and war, that they don't suffer needlessly in future, that the country doesn't degenerate into yet another pattern of different armed groups fighting each other. You know, it's a difficult thing with Afghanistan. This is one of the places in the world that is more awash with weapons as a result of these 42 years of war than most places on earth. And, you know, speaking personally as someone British, where I rarely see weapons. Weapons and peace don't go together very well. So, you know, I hope that this Taliban leadership that we have now is dedicated to creating a functional government, and understands that is going to involve representing all of the people of Afghanistan, and not just their particular group.
Yes, thank you for that. Yes, Taji.
Do you permit me? That was a very interesting point, which I have something on regarding Andy's point. You know, we wish well for our brothers and sisters in Afghanistan, but I think one of the points that's raised a lot in the international discourse right now about Afghanistan, I think part of it, there's a reality which we as Muslims accept, that it's a diverse country. Uzbeks, Tajiks, Pashtuns, it's a diverse place. A lot of the Muslim world is diverse. Pakistan next door is diverse. Maybe not as diverse as Afghanistan, but, you know, the Baluchis, the Sindhis. So there is diversity. And I think one big caution I would have for my fellow Muslims is that inclusivity and unity has become, as defined by the West, has become a stick with which to beat Muslim populations with. Politically, to say, unless you do X, Y, and Z, then this government is illegitimate. So I would advise the Taliban or anybody who comes to power in the Muslim world, you rule by Islam. This is the first basis. The Sharia of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the all-knowing, the creator who revealed the Quran, who knows the human being best, who gave the solutions for mankind, who gave the solutions to the Prophet that you believe in, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That Sharia should be implemented. And the Khilafah state is what implements it. The Khilafah implements Islam. Al-Khilafah ikamatuddin wa tawheed al-Muslimin. It implements Islam and it unites the Muslims. Secondly, the issue of inclusivity. I mean, throughout Islamic history, Muslim Spain, etc., you pray for a wise leadership, people at the top, to take into consideration local realities. Ibrahim mentioned that. And so that it's not seen as one tribe is ruling. We've had time in our history when if people feel that one tribe is in charge, that creates resentment. So you try to have people from different parts of the Khilafah being part of the administration, as walis, as amirs. But in terms of really the Khalifa, the person in charge who implements the Sharia, it all stems from him. The question is not, what's his shoe size? Is he Pashtun? Is he from the Deobandi madhab? Is he Hanafi? Is he Tahriri? Is he Sudanese? The question is, what does he implement? What rules? The constitution is based on what? Where are the rules? Where do the rules come from? The Quran and the Sunnah, Ijma Sahaba Qiyas, the recognized sources of Islamic law, known throughout the centuries, or from man-made law. We took the French Constitution, we took the British Constitution, the US Constitution, we took something from the Sharia, we mismatched it. We matched it all together. So the question in the Khilafah state is, what is the ruler, the Khalifa, what is the ruler ruling by? What is he implementing? And that we all know what is in the Sharia. So we can all go to the same basis. He appointed governors. What's the relationship with others? What are the taxes? If he brings a tax which has no basis in the Sharia, in Islam, we don't have something called income tax. We have ushur, kharaj, fay. We have some other taxes, zakah, on land, arable land, etc. We don't have tax on income. You get an income from your employer and straight away it's taxed. There's no basis in the Sharia. We can argue with the Khalifa to say, you brought something which we see in the West. This is not from our deen. So my point is, in Islam, we're going to have challenges. We're going to have issues of diversity. But today, when the Western government talk about inclusivity, they really mean, do you have some people that are close to us who we left behind? Do we have them in power with you so they can be an influence on you? Do we have the Karzais of this world? Oh, Zalmi Khalizad needs to come again and help you negotiate a government. Zalmi Khalizad, an American man working for the State Department, is going to come and help the new Tunisia, the new Egypt. And this is what Muslims, this is one of the problems Muslims have faced throughout. In the Arab Spring, governments in Egypt, government in Tunisia, they continued to allow Hillary Clinton, Obama, and others to visit and dictate to them, influence what kind of governmental setup they should have. People are Muslims, their beliefs, their tradition are from Islam, the governmental structure that Allah has obliged us to live by, made a duty upon us, fard, is the Islamic Khilafah system, which the Khulafa Rashidin implemented. So this inclusivity, I really want Muslims to take it with a pinch of salt. What is the system? That should be the focus of your question. And yes, the people who implemented, the rulers, the amirs, the walis, the governors, they should be from all over the place, and that's not a problem. But what are they ruling by? That's a very, very, very fundamental question. My last point here is that if the Taliban go down this road, if anybody ruling any Muslim country go down this road of implementing the Islamic system, only Islam can deliver, taking the resources, using the Sharia laws, and dealing with poverty. Because we're not just hooked on growth. Islamic Sharia laws are hooked on distribution of wealth from the rich, from those that have it, to where it does not exist. And you see the focus in zakah, you see the focus in ushur, the tax on arable land. It is focused on independence, having an independent government that rules by the Sharia, that rules for the people, that rules for the ummah, according to the Sharia. That independence means when you look at the world and dealing with anybody, You don't cut yourself off from the world, but you say, we will deal with people based on Islam, our interests, and our interests are defined by Islam. We won't have friendly relations with nations that are killing Muslims, fighting Muslims. Hence the warning with China. You know, China is making a lot of positive noises. The Chinese have Chinese interests. The Chinese don't have the interest of the Taliban. The Americans don't have the interest of the Taliban. Qatar doesn't have the interest of the Taliban because these are non-Islamic regimes. How do they want to help you to implement Islam? So there will be some hardship. There will be some pain. Frankly, I'm not telling people it's going to be roses, but if you implement the laws from Allah, which are tried and tested for over 1,300 years, Muslim Spain, the Muslim world, Baghdad, the Abbasid, the Uthmani Khilafah, people of different races lived under the Khilafah, we distributed wealth, people were prosperous, Zakat was collected in Africa, and we didn't know where to spread it. Islam has a track record. Look to it. And Allah's help will come through that. Anything else will not only lead to problems right now, if we think we're clever and we'll deal with the West. Secondly, we'll allow Western governments who we defeated and kicked out, we will let them in through the back door and let them influence the regime by saying women's rights, human rights, and all these other nonsense which they talk about. And that is the independent cause. When you have an independent cause, over time, the Muslim world becomes strong. You call Muslims to help you. Then you can have a beacon for the world. There are people in the UK who are anti this global capitalist order. They talk about the climate crisis. They talk about this crisis and that crisis. People want leadership in the world today. Where is the Ummah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam? Where are the Muslims? Where are we? I want Muslims to be aspirational. Think ahead. The world needs change. It's going to start somewhere. It's going to start small. It's going to face a lot of problems. It's not going to happen overnight, in 1 year, in 5 years. But you start on a road by implementing Islam, the Islamic Khilafah system. And over time, when the fruits come, because you implemented Islam and gain Allah's help, you will be having discussions with people who oppose the war in London, in Washington, people on the street who will say, you know, we see what that society does over there. We see how they treat the elderly. We treat how they treat women, how they really give women their rights because Islam said so. We see how they don't just go and murder people with drone strikes all over the world. We're interested in that Islamic Khilafah state. Let's have a dialogue with them. Let's look at their example of how human beings can live together. This is the opportunity facing us today, inshallah.
Inshallah. Yes, Ibrahim, the question I had posed to Andy, obviously looking at the hesitancy on the part of the world responding to the Taliban. I just want to focus on the Muslim world because we've got the OIC, we've got the Arab League, we've got Muslim countries, but we've seen very little come out from the Muslim leadership, from Muslim countries to the return of the Taliban in power.
Well, I think much of this comes down to independence that has been mentioned by Brother Taji. Basically, a lot of these countries, the Muslim governments are, whether by choice or by design, they are not independent, or at least not independent in the way that they would like to believe. So, for example, you even mentioned after the Arab Spring, we had Hillary Clinton and people like this coming to different countries and basically mediating between different squabbling princes or politicians or soldiers, whatever, between different factions. And definitely, I think this is one aspect of Islam where of Islam and even just of common sense that if you need a foreigner to mediate between you and your brother or your cousin or whatever next door, you are not independent. So the OIC, the idea was good. It's the idea that was branded was good, that it's an organization where Muslim countries can sort of push Muslim interests. But over 40 years or so, we have not really actually seen much practical, at least in the political terms, we've not seen any real practical initiatives by them. They sort of follow what the dominant states within them do. Such countries as Saudi Arabia, they're always sort of looking over their shoulder at the United States. Similar countries like there's any number of countries. Egypt, which has the potential to be sort of a powerhouse. It's basically the government is an extremely unrepresentative and sort of foreign prop government. So, from both from a Muslim point of view and just from a common sense point of view, if you need someone from the United States or from Germany or from wherever, the UN, if you need him to mediate between you and your neighbor next door, you are not independent in the way that you think you are. So independence is one thing. What was mentioned about representation in the Taliban cabinet, you mentioned the aspect of Islam, and obviously, a lot of people have noted that Islam is one of the very few things, and probably the foremost thing, that sort of binds ethnically diverse Muslim countries together. If even if you go into a mosque in Pakistan, which is a very ethnically diverse country, and it's had ethnic tensions, but you'll see Baloch, Pashtun, Sindhi, Muhajir, whoever, Punjabi, you'll see them praying together. So Islam is definitely it's sort of the glue. The one problem, of course, is that very often purported Islamic groups they even sometimes with the best intentions at heart, but they talk about Islam, and yet they are they sort of view other national or other ethnic or whatever groups or even just other political factions with a lot of suspicion. So that's definitely one factor. With regards to recognition, with regards to representation, for example, in the Taliban government, if you actually look at their cabinet that they announced yesterday, it's mostly the same people who were there in the 1990s, or who were there during the insurgency. So sort of their shadow government. It's almost entirely those people, and they are most of them are Pashtuns, and they're mostly from southern or southeast Afghanistan. If you look at their governors and their sort of corps commanders, things like that, regional commanders, there's a lot more Tajiks and Uzbeks there. So I do think that I actually wrote an article today. I do think that hopefully this is an interim government. They can engage more with other groups, whether that's different ethnic groups or whether it's different political groups. This is very much right now. It's a makeshift sort of government that they have, makeshift sort of cabinet. And that's the reason that they've opted for these sort of old Taliban veterans as ministers, rather than going to engage, because right now the situation in Afghanistan, it's not a very stable one. They're sort of suspicious. They only completed taking control of the entire country a couple of days ago, because there was a sort of a holdout in the Panjshir that they hadn't conquered yet, and it was only after they conquered the Panjshir that they took it. So they're very much a vulnerable government, and I think that's one reason that they have this sort of narrow-based cabinet. Maybe they're going to broaden out. Hopefully they broaden out in the future. But I do think that there's a difference between representation and sort of tokenism. When we saw this outgoing American-backed government, there were a lot of different ethnic groups, or different, there were women in the cabinet, things like that, but very few of them had any power. It was literally just to check off, okay, we have this group, and in particular, the United States has a habit of doing this, and not only the United States, the Soviets did this too. But the United States, whenever they invade a place, they sort of categorize its people into homogeneous blocks. So they say in Iraq, they say there's Sunni Arabs, there's Shias, and there's Kurds. So they don't actually look at the person's political views or his merit or anything like that, but they just want, okay, we're going to have 3 Sunnis, we're going to have 3 Shias, we're going to have 3 Kurds, irrespective of how much support they have or how much how capable they are. Similarly, in Afghanistan, you had we have this many Tajiks, we have this many Pashtuns, we have this many Uzbeks, and what that actually does is that it backfires. It sort of increases tensions, because there becomes a sort of a competition for people to reach political office based on ethnicity. And this has happened a lot in Iraq, especially. It's happened a lot in Afghanistan, and in fact,
Nigeria,
in Afghanistan, it really backfired
places.
because the forces that helped the United States in 2001, they were usually Northerners who are mostly non-Pashtuns. But the United States were convinced that they needed a Pashtun figurehead. So they had Karzai, then they had Ghani, and especially Ghani, he tried to find a Pashtun alternative to the Taliban, and what he found was Pashtun, like, sort of ethno-nationalists. who are who are opposed to the Taliban on ideological grounds, but they're also opposed to Tajiks and they're also opposed to Uzbeks. They're sort of the Pashtun chauvinists. So that backfired a lot, because then the Tajik and Uzbek elites, they started saying, what about us? Like, you're basically trying to undermine us, and there was no trust at all. And in fact, if you look at the Taliban campaign in this summer, the places that fell the quickest were those areas that were mostly non-Pashtun, because the commanders, the governors there, they'd lost, they had no trust in the government, and most of the fighting was, in the between Pashtuns, or between the Taliban Pashtuns and the pro-government Pashtuns. So this basically backfired, because you turn everything into ethnic blocks or sectarian blocks, and there's no merit. So I think there definitely needs to be more representation by the Taliban or by whoever comes into power, but we have to be careful that it doesn't become tokenism of the sort that actually exacerbates tensions.
But Brother Ibrahim, I see your point, and it's a very crucial point which exists now across the world. And I think I would say that, there are two things, and I'm just my concern for us as Muslims is which comes first. When they say representation, the people in charge are from all over the where that society is. I get that. That makes it makes sense. But I think what comes before that is whoever these people or persons are, where do their policies come from? Because when you were explaining just now that some of the places that fell on the way for the Taliban coming to Kabul were areas where they were not Pashtun areas, some of the places that fell quickest. Because when I say to that the people in those areas, maybe a Tajik area, an Uzbek area, what was the concern of the man in that village, in that hamlet, in that small town?
Can I just stop you there for a second, please?
Yes,
I am led to believe that we have got the Taliban spokesperson, Sohail Shaheen, on the phone line. So just very quickly, we'd like to take him on. Brother Sohail, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Welcome, and Jazakallah khairan so much that you are able to join us. And obviously, we have been talking about, for the last 2 hours or so, we've been reflecting on 9/11 and the impact on Afghanistan and the Muslim world at large. And I'm glad that you are able to join us. Now, obviously, 20 years later, I think with a lot of joy, many of us have seen the Taliban return to power. And just to get your reflections on what these 20 years have meant for the Taliban, and since they were taken out of power, and now that they have returned back in the seat of power and ruling Afghanistan.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Nahmaduhu wa nusalli ala Rasulil Kareem. Amma ba'd. Yes, in 9/11, no Afghan was involved, and neither they have approved participation of any Afghan in that incident. And even in 2001, when that incident happened, I was the deputy ambassador of the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan in Islamabad, Pakistan. We tried to resolve this issue peacefully and through talks. But the other side, the American side, and others, they were not ready. They were intending to invade the country. So they invaded the country. While at that time, we were telling, if you come to Afghanistan, you will complicate the issue more. And one day, you will have to talk and to resolve the issue through negotiation. Why not now? If you are going to resolve it through talks after huge destruction and bloodshed. But they invaded Afghanistan, and that exactly happened. We fought our people, our nation for 20 years for our liberation, and at least the Americans, they concluded, they came to the conclusion that the Afghan issue has no military solution. And they contacted us here at the political office based in Doha, Qatar. And we talked for 18 months, or had negotiation for 18 months. and the result was the Doha Agreement, and on the basis of that, they withdraw from the country.
Yes, Jazakallah. And just obviously looking at where we are at this point in time as the Taliban, and we have learned about the cabinet being announced and going forward, looking at, the issue of obviously forming the government, but also at the same time addressing some of the challenges that Afghanistan faced at this point in time. We know of all the damage that has been done to the country, the poverty. We're talking about widows, we're talking about orphans, and just looking at some of these challenges and trying to overcome some of these challenges, Brother Suhail.
Yes, well, you are right. We ended the occupation, but we are facing other challenges. You already mentioned. But we hope that with the help of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and our hardworking people, we will overcome all these challenges facing our people. But at the same time, we call on international communities, other countries, sorry, to help us in this critical time that Afghan people are passing through. So, because there is 70% of the Afghan people living under the line of poverty. So there is huge unemployment. So we need to create employment opportunities for our people. We need to start mega projects, infrastructure projects, and we need to start big projects like railway line, which is to connect South Asia to Central Asia. But that need money. So I think if there is an international donors conference which announced their donation assistance, financial assistance for the people of Afghanistan, that would build peace in our country. Because now they will be helping the people of Afghanistan, not they will be paying for the war, but rather for the construction and rebuilding of Afghanistan. I think it is a very great human thing that they are expected to contribute to that.
Yes, inshallah. And just looking at within Afghanistan, just one more point I'd like to make is we know that a lot in the Western analysts and the Western media has been focusing on the divisions in Afghanistan between ethnic groups and the like as well. And the key issue here at this point in time is the unity of all the Afghan people to recognize and to accept the fact that the Taliban is in power and the Taliban is the government of the day, Brother Suhail.
Yes, about ethnicities, all ethnicities are a part of the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. For example, in the northern provinces, we have Badakhshan. They are Tajik ethnicity, but they are a great part of our security forces are coming from Badakhshan. And also in Faryab, Jozjan, they are Uzbek ethnicities. They are also members of the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. They are making a major part of the Islamic Emirate. In the south, we have Pashtun ethnicity. So, Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan is a combination of ethnicities. They are representing their different ethnicities in the country. And we have also in the government those who are Uzbek and Tajiks, and also Pashtuns, Baluch. We have governors from Baluch ethnicity. So we believe in Islam. In Islam, there is anyone who is pious, more talented, he is the best one. We do not believe in color and ethnicity, but rather in piety, in equality, in justice.
Well, Jazakallah khairan so much for that, and obviously coming right at the end of the show, joining us and to be part of the broadcast this evening. We wish you well, inshallah. Our du'as are with you. Our du'as are with the people of Afghanistan. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make it easy, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Jazakumullahu khairan.
Yes, Brother Taji and Ibrahim, obviously we've come towards the end of the broadcast. Just maybe starting with you, Brother Ibrahim, I'll give about 2 minutes, just a quick comment if you'd like to comment on anything that the Taliban spokesperson said, and just some final thoughts for you in about 2 minutes, inshallah.
Sorry, me or... Sorry, there's an issue with the audio.
Oh, sorry. Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you now. Yeah.
Yes, I just said we've got about 2 minutes. Just a quick comment on the Taliban spokesperson and just some final thoughts.
Well, my thoughts are definitely, I think the Taliban are aware of the issues, that they're facing, which are not easy. Obviously, Afghanistan, there's a lot of poverty. It's still not entirely stable. And it's good to see that they're aware of these issues. I think I would definitely advise, obviously as an outsider who's not on the ground, but I would definitely advise them to continue, working with different groups, just making peace between your brothers fight. But I think one point he raised is very important, is that Afghanistan needs help. It's it's a new government. It's basically isolated by most of the world even now, and the challenges that they're facing are they would be difficult for any government, even in the best of times. So I'm glad to see that they're sort of aware of the challenges, but I would definitely say the international organizations or whatever, they need to deal with them from a position of respect and trust, rather than trying to find loopholes or sorry, not loopholes, trying to find missteps or things like that. I think trust is very important for any relationships, and especially in politics. And Afghanistan, for the sake of the Afghan people, for the sake of Afghanistan as a country, it definitely needs engagement with the international community based off a position of trust.
Jazakallah khairan for that, Taji.
Bismillah. Alhamdulillah, it was good to hear him. And some of the points he mentioned the point about Islam, with this argument about different ethnic groups, and he reminded us, as Allah says in the Quran, inna akramakum indallahi atqakum. So Afghanistan is diverse. Number one, I would tell them to focus. I would advise my brothers and make dua for our ummah in Afghanistan. We all need to do that. One, I would advise them focus on the essentials. The essentials are what? One, ruling by Islam. There's nothing more essential than implementing the Sharia of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in every aspect of life. We do that in our salah, we do that in Ramadan, we do that in our zakah. Now when we come into a position of power, in any Muslim land, the priority for a Muslim who wants Allah's help, Allah's victory, is to implement the Sharia in every aspect, in the politics, in the economies, every place. Secondly, the issue of unity. Reach out to the Muslim world. Afghanistan alone is something we care about because we are Muslims, and therefore they need to reach out to us, and we are ready to respond. The Muslim Ummah has experts, thinkers, geologists, petroleum, mineral experts, people who know how to run an Islamic economy. Reach out to us, reach out to the Muslim world, and we will help. Number three, why? Because of the basic problems that exist right now, providing food, access to clean water, the basics. This is what they have to focus on. Everything else, honestly, is luxury and just has to wait. But number three, in doing that, is really to be very, very careful and aware of the West. So when he talks about an international donor conference, we've had international donor conferences over Lebanon, over Libya, over this, over that. Those conferences result in what? So my point is not that the Taliban or any other Muslim is in power should not engage with the world, but you engage with the world from a position of we need to be independent because Islam said so. We need to implement Islam, and we need to look after our interests, our Islamic interests. that Islam is put first, not just some pragmatic interest, because where does that lead to? It will be like the rest of the Muslim world. Pakistan takes loans from the IMF, form of slavery. So does the whole Muslim world. So in every aspect, diplomatically, economically, we enslave ourselves. We go to the West and we do this. We say, "Oi, here are my hands, handcuffs, economic, political handcuffs." This is a lesson we can learn. We ask Allah to help them. We ask Allah to aid them and that they unite, implement the Sharia, reach out to the Muslim world to help. We have the resources, human, financial, physical, to help our Ummah in Afghanistan and elsewhere. Call out, reach out, implement Islam, the Sharia, this Islamic Khilafah system. And with Allah's help, the amazing things can happen only with the help of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
Well, Jazakallah khairan so much for that, Brother Taji, and also Brother Ibrahim. I know we had a note from Andy Worthington. He had to leave for another interview, so he had to leave us as well. So he had to just cut his interview a bit short. But wonderful having both of you, and also, with Andy as well. And also we're looking at Brother Sami, who had basically joined us initially as well. Wonderful discussion, inshallah. Jazakallah, Allah accept, Allah reward your efforts.
Allah reward your efforts. Assalamu alaikum, Ibrahim.
Nice to talk.
Walaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa
Walaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Well, that brings us to the end of the broadcast this evening. And once again, it's been wonderful being in the company of Salam Media on the various platforms. So until we meet again next week, same time, same place. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.